I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine locking eyes with an animal. It could be, a dog sitting across from you in your living room, or a crow perched on a fence post outside, or maybe even an elephant on a massive African savanna. And in that brief moment of connection, you look into those eyes and you just wonder, is there someone home?
Right, like, is there an actual mind behind those eyes?
Exactly. And for centuries, the rigid halls of science told us the answer to that question was just a definitive no. They basically told us we were projecting our own human emotions onto biological machines. But the strange paradox of all this is that while the smartest minds in academia were writing these dense, heavy papers denying that animals could feel pain or joy, every day people were looking at the scientists like they were completely out of their minds.
Yeah, the sources actually have a perfect anecdote to illustrate that massive disconnect. There was this researcher who was desperately trying to publish a book proving scientifically that animals feel pain.
Which sounds ridiculous to even have to prove, right?
Totally. So he brings this concept to a group of mechanics at a Harley-Davidson motorcycle shop. And he starts explaining his thesis, detailing all these complex neurological arguments he's using to convince veterinarians and biologists that a dog or a horse actually experiences suffering.
And how did the mechanics take it?
They just stared at him in total bewilderment. They basically laughed and asked, who doesn't know that?
I love that. That perfectly captures the absurdity of the whole situation. I mean, how did the brightest scientific minds on the planet spend centuries pretending dogs couldn't feel fear while mechanics at a motorcycle shop knew it as just an obvious fact of life? So we are unpacking a massive stack of sources today for our deep dives to answer exactly that.
And we've got an incredible range of materials to go through, too.
We really do. We're going from groundbreaking field research in places like Amboseli National Park in Kenya to cutting-edge neurobiology, right down to profound philosophical texts on animal ethics. And the overarching mission of this deep dive is to explore how the scientific paradigm is fundamentally shifting. We are moving from seeing animals as objects, as resources, to recognizing them as unique individuals with their own rich inner lives.
Which is a massive, massive shift.
It really is. So to kick us off, how did the scientific establishment get it so wrong for so long? Where did this start?
Well, to really understand the origin of that scientific blind spot,
Yeah.
we have to trace the philosophical lineage all the way back to René Descartes in the 17th century.
Oh, the I think therefore I am guy.
That's the one. Descartes established a concept that philosophers call a moral cleavage between humans and everything else. He argued that humans possessed a rational soul, which he actually believed interacted with the physical body through the pineal gland in the brain.
Wow, that's specific.
Yeah, very specific. But according to his framework, this soul was the absolute seat of consciousness, language, and feeling. And because animals did not possess human language, Descartes concluded they did not possess this rational soul.
But he didn't just stop at saying they were less intelligent than us,
Right.
right? He took it to a genuinely terrifying extreme. He literally argued they were biological automata.
He did, yeah. He basically viewed them as complex clocks made of flesh and bone. If you think about a mechanical clock, it has gears and springs that make the hands move. And if the clock makes a sound, it's just the grinding of the gears.
Right.
Descartes applied this exact logic to a dog whimpering. If you hit a dog and it cries out, Descartes argued that you are simply hearing the mechanical friction of its internal biology reacting to a stimulus. He claimed there is no mind inside the dog experiencing the pain. It is merely a physical reflex, totally devoid of internal suffering.
The convenience of that philosophy is really hard to ignore, honestly. I mean, if an animal is just an unfeeling machine, then you have zero ethical constraints on how you use it. You can use them for grueling labor, for food, or for brutal medical experimentation without a second thought. It essentially gives humanity a philosophical blank check to just dominate the natural world.
Oh, absolutely. And the theological traditions of the time heavily reinforced this. There was a strong ideological need to separate humanity from the rest of the animal kingdom to justify a hierarchy where humans sit at the absolute top, just below the divine.
Right. It fit perfectly into the worldview of the era.
Exactly. But what is truly surprising is that this Cartesian view wasn't just a relic of the 1600s. It mutated, and it survived well into the 20th century under the guise of rigorous science, specifically through the school of behaviorism.
Ah, the behaviorists. So we're talking about B.F. Skinner, John B. Watson. These were the absolute titans of 20th century psychology.
They were. And they essentially created a professional straitjacket for the entire field of biology and ethology. Behaviorism argued that science can only study what is strictly observable and measurable. You cannot observe a mind. You cannot measure a feeling.
So they just threw it all out.
Completely. They said feelings and minds belong to the realm of poetry, not science. If a scientist attributed any internal emotional state or intent to an animal, they were hit with an accusation that could legitimately end their career, which was anthropomorphism.
Right, the cardinal sin of projecting human traits onto non-humans.
It was enforced with ruthless strictness in academia. Like if you were observing a rat in a maze, you could not write in your paper, "The rat was hungry, so it searched for the cheese," because hunger is an internal state. You could only describe the mechanical input and output.
So what do they have to write instead?
They had to say something like, "The rat was deprived of food for 24 hours, and it moved toward the food source at a velocity of x." If you suggested the rat actually wanted the food, you were accused of being unscientific, and you risked losing your funding and your tenure.
That is just wild to me. I mean, I understand the desire for scientific rigor, but looking back, isn't denying the existence of an animal's mind just as deeply unscientific as projecting human emotions onto them?
It's a huge blind spot.
It's like looking at a complex computer that's processing massive amounts of data, reacting to viruses, and optimizing its battery life, and I refuse to believe there is a CPU inside just because I can't physically see it through the casing. That's not being rigorous. That's being stubbornly blind to the obvious mechanism driving the behavior.
That analogy actually highlights the core logical flaw that eventually brought the whole behaviorist wall down. By categorically banning the concept of internal states, behaviorists basically guaranteed they would fundamentally misunderstand the motivations driving the very behaviors they were dedicating their lives to studying. We see a perfect example of this academic ostracization in the story of Donald Griffin.
Oh, Donald Griffin. He was the scientist who originally figured out how bats use echolocation, right? He was a highly respected, rigorous researcher.
He was a total titan in his field. But in 1976, Griffin published a book called The Question of Animal Awareness. And in it, he didn't even make these sweeping, absolute claims. He simply suggested that it was scientifically probable that animals could think, and that we should probably investigate it.
And how did the establishment react?
Just for raising the question, he was treated as a pariah by a massive portion of his orthodox colleagues. They viewed him as a once rigorous scientist who had essentially gone soft in his later years.
So we have this massive, centuries-long academic barricade. On one side, you have common sense, motorcycle mechanics, and pet owners who observe joy and fear in animals every single day. On the other side, you have an entrenched scientific establishment demanding proof of the invisible. What actually forced the scientific community to finally abandon the ghost of Descartes?
The turning point didn't come from philosophical arguments. It came from undeniable, hard biological data. The tools of neuroscience advanced to the point where we could no longer ignore the physical reality inside the animal brain. And this culminated in a massive watershed moment in 2012, known as the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness.
Okay, this is a remarkable document. It wasn't just a few fringe researchers, right? We're talking about an international consortium of prominent cognitive neuroscientists, neuropharmacologists, and neuroanatomists. I think Stephen Hawking was even there as the guest of honor when they signed it. What exactly did they declare?
They officially stated that the weight of biological evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. They declared that all mammals, all birds, and even many invertebrates, like octopuses, possess the physical hardware required for conscious experience.
Let's break down the mechanics of that for a second, because when a group of top-tier neuroscientists use the word consciousness, what exactly are they referring to? The word gets thrown around a lot in spiritual and philosophical contexts, so we should be precise.
It's crucial to define it in a strict neurological sense here. The neuroscientist Christoph Koch, who is cited in our sources, provides a wonderfully clarifying definition. He states that consciousness is simply the thing that feels like something.
The thing that feels like something. I really like that.
Right. Think about the autonomic functions of your own body. As we were sitting here talking, your stomach is digesting your breakfast. Your liver is metabolizing toxins. White blood cells are fighting off microscopic pathogens, right? Hopefully. But all of those complex biological processes are happening inside you right now, and you do not feel them. They're completely unconscious. But if you accidentally bite your tongue while eating, there's an immediate sharp sensation. That pain feels like something. The part of you that experiences the pain, the part that is aware of the suffering, that is consciousness, is the internal subjective experience of the physical world.
And the Cambridge Declaration essentially proved that animals have the biological equipment to have that exact subjective experience. How did they prove that? Because for a really long time, the argument was that you needed a massive, highly developed human neocortex, like that wrinkly outer layer of our brain, to experience consciousness at all.
And the neuroanatomical research proved that assumption totally wrong. The neocortex is actually not the seat of primary emotional consciousness. The core emotions, fear, rage, panic, maternal care, and joy, are generated deep within the ancient subcortical structures of the brain. We are talking about areas like the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the periaqueductal gray.
Which are way older, evolutionarily speaking.
Exactly. These are evolutionary ancient structures that sit deep below the neocortex. And when researchers mapped the brains of non-human mammals, they found the exact same structures wired in the exact same way.
It's not just that they look similar on an MRI, though. The actual chemical language pulsing through those circuits is identical.
The continuity is absolute. Evolution is an incredibly conservative process. It rarely invents entirely new systems if an old system works perfectly well. It just builds upon existing architecture. When a human mother bonds with her newborn child, that profound feeling of love and connection is heavily mediated by the release of a hormone called oxytocin.
Right, the love hormone.
Yeah. And when an elephant mother comforts her calf, or when a dog gazes into the eyes of its owner, their brains are flooded with the exact same oxytocin molecule.
That is amazing. And it's the same for negative emotions, too, right? Cortisol is the universal stress hormone. Serotonin manages mood and anxiety across almost the entire animal kingdom.
It does. And this chemical continuity brings us to one of the most fascinating and, frankly, slightly unsettling lines of evidence in the sources, which is neuropharmacology. The proof of shared sentience isn't just anatomical, it is heavily pharmaceutical.
Unsettling is the right word for it. The sources detail how animals suffer from the exact same psychological and psychiatric disorders that humans do. We aren't just projecting our anxieties onto them. They experience genuine PTSD, obsessive-compulsive disorders, and severe clinical depression.
And the ultimate proof that the underlying mechanisms of these illnesses are identical is that animals respond to the exact same human pharmaceutical medications. I mean, if the biology was fundamentally different, a drug designed to target a specific human neurotransmitter receptor would have absolutely no effect on an animal.
Oh.
But that's not what happens.
The sources mention dogs exhibiting compulsive behaviors, right? Like incessantly licking their paws until they bleed, or constantly chasing their tails to the point of sheer exhaustion.
Yes, severe OCD behaviors.
And when researchers scan their brains, they find the exact same abnormalities in the neural pathways that you see in human patients with OCD. And then, when veterinarians prescribe fluoxetine, which is the generic name for Prozac, a human SSRI antidepressant, the dog's symptoms subside. The human drug literally fixes the dog's brain.
It's incredible. And there is an even more extreme example in the sources involving invertebrates. Researchers conducted a study on crayfish.
Wait, invertebrates? Like bugs?
Crustaceans, actually, crayfish. They took these animals and subjected them to mild, unpredictable electrical shocks. Afterward, they observed the crayfish's behavior, and the animals exhibited classic signs of clinical anxiety. They hid in the dark corners of their tanks, they completely refused to explore, and they avoided food.
Poor little guys.
I know. But when the researchers analyzed the crayfish's neurochemistry, they found significantly elevated levels of serotonin, completely mirroring a human anxiety response.
Crayfish. We are talking about an animal that diverged from our evolutionary tree hundreds of millions of years ago.
Yes. And to test the chemical pathways, the researchers took chlordiazepoxide, which is a highly common anti-anxiety medication frequently prescribed to humans to calm the central nervous system, and they administered it to the traumatized crayfish.
Wait, they gave human anti-anxiety meds to a crustacean. What happened?
The medication bound to the GABA receptors in the crayfish's nervous system, completely reversed the anxiety symptoms, and the crayfish returned to their normal exploratory behavior.
That is staggering. The exact same drug that calms a human having a panic attack calms a crayfish that has been traumatized. Given that reality that we share the exact same neurochemical architecture, that they suffer from the same mental illnesses, and that they're cured by the exact same human drugs, doesn't the entire burden of proof in the scientific community need to completely flip?
The philosophical implication there is profound, because for decades, the behaviorist assumption was that we must treat animals as unfeeling machines until someone can definitively, undeniably prove they have a mind. But given the overwhelming weight of anatomical, chemical, and pharmaceutical continuity, the most scientifically rigorous assumption is the exact opposite.
Right. If I look at a biological organism and I can see that it possesses the precise neural circuitry designed by evolution to process physical pain and emotional distress, and then I see that organism exhibiting behaviors that clearly indicate it is in distress, the simplest, most logical conclusion is that the organism is experiencing distress. To assume that the biological machinery is firing and the behavior is occurring but the lights are completely off inside the house, that requires a massive illogical leap of faith.
It requires a willful suspension of the fundamental biological principle of evolutionary continuity. Once you accept that the biological hardware for consciousness is universally present, you can stop arguing over whether the engine exists and start marveling at how the car actually drives.
I love that. Let's do exactly that. We've established the neurological baseline. The hardware is there. Now we get to look at the software in action. And to do that, the sources take us out of the laboratory and onto the African savanna to observe one of the most socially complex minds on the planet, which is the elephant.
Yes, the African savanna provides a perfect environment to study advanced cognition, because survival there is extraordinarily difficult. It requires immense problem-solving skills and deep, deep cooperation. Elephant societies are a brilliant case study in how complex minds navigate a harsh world. They operate in a structure that behavioral ecologists call a fission-fusion society.
Let's unpack that term a bit. How does fission fusion actually work on the ground?
Basically, it means the social structure is highly fluid but deeply interconnected. You have a core family unit, usually a group of related females and their calves. And depending on the ecological conditions, like how much grass is available, how much water is in the watering holes, these family units will split apart, or fission, to avoid depleting the resources in one small area.
So they spread out to survive.
Exactly. They might travel miles away from each other, but they are constantly communicating over those vast distances, and when resources are plentiful again, they will come back together or fusion into massive herds of hundreds of individuals.
So they aren't just wandering aimlessly, they are managing a massive distributed social network. And at the absolute center of that network, the linchpin holding the entire society together is the matriarch.
An elephant herd is matriarchy in the truest sense of the word. The oldest female leads the family. But her leadership isn't based on physical dominance or aggression at all. It is entirely based on living history. She is the repository of the family's ecological knowledge. In an environment where the climate is unpredictable and extreme, survival depends entirely on the stored memories inside the matriarch's brain.
The sources outline a devastating but incredibly clear example of this from Amboseli National Park in Kenya. In 2008, the region was hit by a catastrophic drought. The normal watering holes dried up, the vegetation withered. It was an absolute crisis of survival.
It was terrible. And the researchers in Amboseli had been tracking the elephant families for decades, so they had exact data on the ages of all the matriarchs. When they analyzed the mortality rates after the drought finally broke, the numbers were staggering. The families led by younger matriarchs suffered horrific losses. Their calves died, and many of the adults starved. But the families led by matriarchs over the age of 50 had drastically higher survival rates.
Why? What did the 50-year-old elephant know that the 30-year-old didn't?
The older matriarchs had lived through a similarly severe drought decades earlier. Their massive hippocampi, which is a part of the brain responsible for spatial memory, had stored the exact geographic locations of hidden secondary water sources and famine foods that hadn't been needed in 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah, the younger matriarchs simply didn't possess that data. The older females drew upon their ancient memories and successfully navigated their families across miles of arid landscape to safety. The young matriarchs just wandered the dying plains relying on instinct, and their families perished.
It's essentially a distributed backup server for the ecosystem. If you lose the oldest matriarch, you don't just lose one animal, you lose the data required to keep the entire network alive during a crisis. That level of societal reliance on individual memory brings us to the work of Cynthia Moss. Her insights are featured heavily in the sources. She spent over 40 years observing these specific elephant families in Amboseli. And reading her accounts, it forces a complete paradigm shift in how you view wildlife.
Moss's great revelation was that observing an elephant herd is not simply watching a species execute its biological programming. You're observing a highly specific collection of distinct individuals. It took her years of patient observation to fully grasp the nuanced personalities interacting within a single family unit.
She describes them the way you would describe a group of people at a family reunion. Like, one elephant is known for being consistently dignified and gentle with the calves. Another is notoriously grumpy and a bit of a bully. Another is a playful teenager who constantly instigates games. Another is incredibly diligent, just always scanning the horizon.
And Moss discovered that she could accurately predict how an entire family group would react to a novel situation, like a strange vehicle approaching or a predator on the horizon, simply by reading the subtle behavioral cues of the specific matriarch leading them. If the matriarch was a nervous individual, the family would flee. If she was confident, they would stand their ground. The personality of the leader completely dictated the culture of the group.
There is a researcher working alongside Moss, Katito Sayela, who has developed an ability that seems almost superhuman. She can visually identify up to 900 individual elephants just on sight. She knows their ear tiers, the curve of their tusks, the specific shape of their heads.
It's a wildly impressive skill. But while Sayalel's ability is remarkable, the truly profound realization is that the elephants themselves possess an even greater capacity for recognition. They recognize hundreds of individuals across the savanna. They use olfactory cues, vocalizations, and visual memory to maintain a massive social map in their heads. They know exactly who is a friend, who is a rival, who is a distant cousin, and who is a total stranger.
And they even understand what researchers call third-party relationships. Can you explain the mechanics of how we know they understand that? Because that implies a level of cognitive mapping that goes way beyond simple recognition.
Absolutely. Understanding a third-party relationship means you don't just know your relationship to another individual. You understand the relationship between two other individuals.
Okay, give me an example of that in the wild.
So, if a young elephant calf is in distress and cries out, an unrelated adult female nearby won't just blindly comfort the calf herself. She will actively look around the herd, identify the specific mother of that specific calf, and go over to alert the mother. The adult female holds a mental database that explicitly links calf A to mother B.
It's just like living in a small town. It's not just a herd of identical gray shapes migrating across the grass. It's a deeply woven community where everyone knows everyone else's business, their lineage, and their alliances. But here's the critical point. You cannot have a society built on long-term, complex relationships without a mechanism to hold it all together. And that mechanism is emotion.
Precisely. This brings us directly to the reality of empathy and grief in the animal kingdom. And when we use the word empathy in this context, we aren't using it as a poetic metaphor. We're defining it scientifically as the cognitive and emotional capacity to perceive, understand, and share the internal emotional state of another individual. And the sources detail observations that prove this capacity beyond any reasonable doubt.
One of the most heartbreaking but also illuminating stories in the research involves a dying matriarch named Eleanor in Kenya's Samburu National Reserve. Can you walk us through what happened to her and, more importantly, how the surrounding elephants reacted?
So Eleanor was the matriarch of her family, but she fell severely ill and collapsed. She was just weak and entirely unable to stand, which, as we know, is a fatal situation for a heavy animal on the savanna. Another female elephant named Grace happened to be nearby. What's crucial to note here is that Grace was from a completely different family group.
Oh, wow. So she was not a close relative protecting her own genetic lineage.
Not at all. But Grace rushed over to the collapsed Eleanor. She used her own tusks and her trunk to physically try to lift the massive matriarch back to her feet.
The biomechanics of that are incredible. I mean, an elephant trying to lift another elephant requires immense effort and pure intentionality.
And when the lifting failed, Grace didn't just abandon her. She stayed by Eleanor's side as the sun set. She used her trunk to gently stroke Eleanor's head and body, actively attempting to comfort her as she died. But the demonstration of empathy didn't end with Grace. Over the next 5 days, Eleanor's body lay on the savanna. A parade of elephants from completely unrelated families traveled to the site.
They weren't coming to scavenge, obviously. They were coming to investigate.
Right. They engaged in profound mourning rituals. They would stand silently over the body, smelling her, gently touching the carcass with their trunks. The researchers observing this concluded it was an undeniable demonstration of cross-family compassion and a clear cognitive interest in the reality of death.
This fascination with death is actually highly specific, too. When an elephant comes across the bones of another elephant, they don't just sniff the pile and move on. They exhibit a highly focused investigation of specific parts of the skeleton.
They do. They focus intensely on the skulls, the jaws, and the tusks. They will pick up the bones and pass them back and forth. Evolutionary biologists point out that the jaw and the tusks are the most highly recognizable individual features of an elephant. So they are investigating the physical remnants of a specific who. They are interacting with the memory of an individual.
And we know this grief manifests physically, not just behaviorally. There is the story of the famous matriarch Echo. She was the leader of one of the most studied families in Amboseli. When she died of natural causes, her daughter, Enid, took over the leadership role. Months later, the researchers who had known them for years finally caught up with the family in the field. What did they see?
The physical reaction of Enid upon seeing the researchers was profound. Elephants have temporal glands located on the sides of their heads, between the eye and the ear. These glands excrete a dark fluid during times of intense emotion, stress, or excitement. As the researchers approached the family and began speaking to Enid, recognizing her, Enid's temporal glands began streaming fluid down her face. She exhibited severe lethargy and visible signs of what a human psychiatrist would classify as severe depression. She was physically manifesting the immense grief of losing her mother, the sudden crushing burden of having to lead the family alone.
The depth of that feeling is just astounding. But what truly shatters the boundaries of how we view animal intelligence is when this empathy crosses the species barrier entirely. When an animal recognizes suffering in a creature that looks absolutely nothing like it.
The sources outline an incredible case that occurred at the Denver Zoo. A male African elephant collapsed in his enclosure. He was elderly and weak, and he couldn't get his massive body back upright. Again, for an elephant, being stuck on the ground for an extended period can be fatal.
But the zoo also housed Asian elephants. Now, African and Asian elephants are entirely different species. They diverged millions of years ago. They look different. Their social structures are different.
Right, but they were being herded past the collapsed African elephant. When the Asian elephants saw him struggling on the ground, they immediately broke ranks. They completely ignored their keepers, rushed over to the fallen African elephant, surrounded him, and began using their heads and trunks to nudge him. They wedged themselves under him and physically supported his weight, lifting together until he could lock his knees and stand on his own.
That's unbelievable.
They recognized the mechanical and emotional distress of an alien species and worked cooperatively to save him.
There are even documented instances of wild elephants extending this empathy to humans, which sounds like a total myth, but it's a documented behavioral observation in the sources. A woman was lost in the wilderness. She was exhausted, half-blind, and she eventually collapsed under a tree and fell asleep.
She was in a highly vulnerable position in an environment filled with predators like hyenas and lions. But when she woke up, she found herself surrounded by wild elephants. And instead of trampling her or perceiving her as a threat, they had actively worked to protect her. They had broken branches off the surrounding trees and carefully laid them over her sleeping body to conceal her from predators.
They looked at a human, a species that is historically their greatest predator, by the way, and they recognized vulnerability. They took intentional physical action to shelter her. How do you explain that from a purely behaviorist perspective? You can't. It is an act of proactive cross-species compassion.
And it is essential to note that while elephants are brilliant examples because their size makes their actions so visible to us, this emotional depth is not exclusive to them at all. The sources overflow with examples across the entire phylogenetic tree.
Like the magpies holding funerals for a fallen flock member. They find a dead magpie, they stand around it in total silence, and then they fly off to find specific pieces of grass and lay them by the body, almost like a wreath.
We see gorillas and meerkats engaging in complex play. For decades, scientists argued that animal play was strictly a survival mechanism, like young animals practicing hunting or fighting. But field observations show adult meerkats and gorillas playing in ways that have absolutely no survival value. They are engaging in the activity purely for the neurological reward of joy. They're just having fun.
And we see the dark side of that emotional capacity, too. Wolves suffering from clinical PTSD. The sources detail a wild wolf named Tenino. She was darted with a tranquilizer from a helicopter, captured and relocated. The trauma of that event broke her psychology completely. She developed severe hypovigilance, generalized fear, and exaggerated startle responses that the other wolves in her pack didn't exhibit. She was clinically traumatized by the human intervention.
If we pull back and look at the evolutionary biology of all this, we have to ask why. Why did nature select for grief in an elephant, or joy in a meerkat, or trauma in a wolf? Because emotions are not a human luxury. They are the ultimate social glue. For any species that relies on cooperation, family structure, and community to survive a harsh environment, emotion is an absolute evolutionary necessity. You cannot have a functioning wolf pack coordinating a hunt or an elephant herd defending its young against lions if the individual members do not fiercely internally care about one another's well-being. Emotion is the mechanism that ensures cooperation.
So if we accept that animals are feeling deeply, that their emotional engines are running hot, it begs the next massive question. How are they thinking? How are these deeply emotional creatures navigating a world filled with shifting alliances, scarce resources, and constant danger? This leads us into the cognitive realm of problem solving, agency, and what the sources refer to as animal genius.
To accurately assess animal intelligence, we first have to fundamentally redefine how we measure intelligence itself. Historically, the scientific community has treated human intelligence, specifically our capacity for complex logic, mathematics, and syntactical language, as the ultimate measuring stick for all life on Earth.
It's the IQ test fallacy. We judge an animal's brilliance based on how well it mimics a human.
Exactly. But modern psychology, heavily influenced by frameworks like Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, recognizes that even within humanity, intelligence is not a single monolith. We have spatial intelligence, bodily kinesthetic intelligence, interpersonal intelligence. When we evaluate animals, we must extend this framework. Evolution hones an animal's cognitive abilities to perfectly match the specific demands of its ecological niche.
The classic example of this is a squirrel. I mean, if you try to teach a squirrel to count to 10, it will fail, and you might conclude the squirrel is stupid. Because a squirrel's survival doesn't require abstract mathematics. But a squirrel can bury 10,000 individual nuts across miles of shifting forest terrain in the fall, and then successfully remember the exact spatial coordinates of almost every single one of them months later under a thick layer of snow. That is a feat of spatial memory that would completely short-circuit the most brilliant human mind.
The squirrel is a genius at being a squirrel. When scientists only started testing animals on their own cognitive turf, the results completely dismantled long-held assumptions about human uniqueness. One of the most significant barriers to fall was the concept of theory of mind.
Oh, let's explain theory of mind, because this is a massive cognitive milestone.
Theory of mind is the cognitive ability to recognize that another individual possesses a mind, with thoughts, perspectives, and intentions that are entirely separate from your own. It is the ability to put yourself in someone else's mental shoes. For a long time, cognitive scientists insisted this was an exclusively human trait.
But the scrub jays proved them wrong. Scrub jays are these incredibly clever birds that survive by caching or hiding their food, and researchers designed this highly elegant experiment to test their cognition.
The mechanics of the study are brilliant. A scrub jay is given a peanut to bury, but the researchers arrange it so that another bird is watching the jay hide the food. The jay burying the peanut observes the spectator. The jay proceeds to finish burying the nut, smooths over the dirt, and acts completely natural. However, the moment the spectator bird is removed from the room, the first jay immediately returns to the cache, digs up the peanut, and moves it to a completely new, secret location.
Let's break down the cognitive sequence required to execute that behavior, because it's nuts. First, the jay has to recognize the presence of the other bird. Second, the jay has to understand that the other bird's visual perspective allows it to see the hiding spot. Third, and this is the theory of mind right here, the jay has to project an intention onto the other bird, like, he saw me hide this, therefore he intends to steal it. And finally, the jay formulates a deceptive strategy to thwart an event that hasn't even happened yet. That is not a blind reflex, that is a masterclass in deception, and deception is literally impossible without a theory of mind.
We see traditional boundaries shattering when it comes to tool use and cultural transmission as well. Anthropology used to define humanity as man the toolmaker. We assumed we were the only creatures capable of manipulating our environment with external objects.
Which is almost comical now, given the sheer volume of evidence against it. Chimpanzees in the wild don't just use tools, they possess distinct tool use cultures.
Researchers have documented up to 25 different tool use techniques among wild chimpanzees. A group in one forest might use short, sturdy sticks to crack open hard nuts, using a flat rock as an anvil. A group in another forest might carefully strip the leaves off a long, flexible twig to fish for termites in a mound.
And the critical part is that these behaviors are not genetically hardwired. A chimp isn't born knowing how to fish for termites. They learn it through cultural transmission. The young observe the adults, practice the technique, and pass it down to the next generation. The knowledge is stored in the culture, not the DNA.
We see innovation and cultural transmission across species, too. The sources detail the famous case of Emo, a young Japanese macaque monkey. Researchers were studying her troop on an island and would leave sweet potatoes on the sandy beach for them. The monkeys hated the sand on the potatoes, so they would painstakingly try to brush it off with their hands.
But Emo, who was essentially a young innovator, had a brilliant idea. She took her sweet potato, walked down to the ocean, and washed it in the water. Not only did the water remove the grit, but the salt water actually seasoned the potato and made it taste better.
It was a massive technological breakthrough for them. And the researchers watched as this specific innovation spread. First, Emo's peers learned it from observing her. Then the adult mothers learned it from the youngsters. Eventually, the entire society adopted the technology, and decades later, every macaque on that island washes their food in the ocean. Emo invented a cultural practice.
We even see animals cooperating to execute complex, multi-stage plans. Look at the humpback whales and their bubble net feeding technique. The hydrodynamics and the coordination required for this are staggering.
Bubble net feeding is a highly choreographed group hunting strategy. A pod of whales will dive deep below a massive school of herring or krill. They don't just blindly swim upward, they divide into highly specialized teams.
It's like a perfectly executed military operation.
Exactly. Specific whales take on the role of colors. They emit a deafening, highly specific acoustic song that panics the fish and drives them toward the surface. Other whales take on the role of blockers. They swim in an upward spiral, releasing a continuous stream of air from their blowholes, creating a physical cylinder of bubbles that the fish are afraid to swim through. The fish are trapped in a shrinking, rising net of air.
And then the lungers come up from the bottom, mouths wide open, swallowing the concentrated ball of prey. And the most incredible detail from the research is that these roles are consistent. Year after year, when these specific hunting crews assemble, the same whale takes on the role of the caller, and the same whales act as the blockers. They aren't acting on instinct. They are executing a practiced, coordinated team strategy based on individual expertise. Okay, I have to push back here for a second, though. I hear everything you're saying. The tool use with the chimps, the team hunting with the whales, the deception with the scrub jays. But aren't we still kind of falling into the exact same trap we were just criticizing? Aren't we still validating their intelligence only when it looks like ours? Like, oh wow, the chimp uses a stick like a hammer. He's so smart because he's acting like a human carpenter. Or the whales hunt in teams. They are smart because they look like human fishermen.
That is an incredibly astute observation, and it highlights a major philosophical tension in the sources. You are pointing out the exact danger of anthropocentrism. If we only validate animal intelligence when it mirrors human behavior, we are still positioning humanity as the absolute center of the universe. We desperately need to stop asking if animals are smart enough to be human and start asking if we are smart enough to understand animals on their own terms.
This need to constantly rank them based on human traits leads to some genuinely arrogant scientific frameworks. Our sources feature a deep critique of the legal scholar Stephen Wise. He created something called an autonomy scale to quantify the cognitive value of animals in the eyes of the law.
Wise's intention was to secure legal rights for animals, which is a noble goal. But the methodology he used is highly problematic. He created a numerical scale based entirely on how closely an animal's cognition resembles human cognition. Humans are the gold standard, set at a 1.0.
And then he just grades everyone else on a curve. Apes get a 0.98, dolphins might get a 0.85, dogs get a 0.68. It treats human intelligence as the absolute pinnacle of evolutionary achievement, and every other creature on the planet is just a defective, lesser version of us.
The philosopher Martha Nussbaum sharply critiques this scale in the sources. She calls it a phony, arrogant sort of anthropocentrism. It's a ratings game that totally ignores the staggering ecological diversity of animal life. A blue whale doesn't need to manipulate tools with hands. It has a body perfectly evolved to filter thousands of pounds of food from the ocean. It doesn't need human syntax. It has an auditory communication system that can transmit complex information across entire ocean basins. Grading a whale based on its ability to do human tasks is frankly absurd.
This brings us back to Cynthia Moss. Her response to an interviewer was my absolute favorite part of the entire stack of research. After spending 40 years intimately observing the emotional and cognitive lives of elephants, an interviewer asked her, "What do elephants teach us about humanity?"
And Moss completely rejected the premise of the question.
She completely deflected it. She essentially said, "Nothing, and I don't care." She explicitly stated that she's not interested in studying elephants to learn more about people. She wants to understand a crow as a crow, and a dog as a dog, and an elephant as an elephant. It is such a profound, humbling shift in perspective. to stop using the natural world as a mirror for our own egos.
To facilitate that shift in perspective, Martha Nussbaum introduces a philosophical framework called the capabilities approach. Historically, a lot of animal ethics, like the utilitarianism championed by Peter Singer, focus primarily on pain. As long as an animal isn't suffering physically, its ethical needs are met. But Nussbaum argues that is vastly insufficient.
Right, because an animal is more than just a biological pain receptor.
Exactly. The capabilities approach asks us to look at the specific biology and ecology of a creature and ask, what are the characteristic ends this creature is striving for? What does a flourishing life look like for this specific being? All sentient creatures, whether they are pigs, chimpanzees, or crows, have a set of innate capabilities they are driven to exercise. They want to make choices about their movements. They strive to affiliate with their family members. They have a biological drive to play, to explore, and to exert some level of control over their environment.
We should evaluate our treatment of them based on whether we are allowing them to exercise their capabilities, not whether they meet our arbitrary standards of intelligence. And to really grasp what an animal's capabilities are, we have to grapple with the scientific concept of the Umwelt.
Umwelt is a German word that translates roughly to environment. But in biology, it refers to the specific sensory reality that a particular organism inhabits. Every animal lives in its own sensory bubble. Because humans are primates, our Umwelt is overwhelmingly visual and heavily reliant on complex language. We assume the world is primarily composed of what we can see and what we can say.
But a dog's Umwelt is fundamentally different. A dog navigates the world through an incredibly rich, three-dimensional landscape of olfactory information. They can smell the passage of time, they can smell fear hormones, they perceive a chemical reality that we are completely blind to.
Or consider the elephant's Umwelt, which expands into realms of physics we cannot detect without advanced machinery. Elephants communicate constantly using infrasonic rumbles.
Oh, let's explain the mechanics of infrasound, because this is mind-blowing.
So human hearing bottoms out at around 20 hertz. Anything vibrating slower than that is basically inaudible to us. Elephants routinely vocalize at 14 or 15 hertz. These are massive, deep, rolling sound waves. And because low-frequency sounds degrade very slowly, these rumbles travel for miles and miles, not just through the air, but through the ground itself.
They're essentially broadcasting seismic waves.
Yes, and the elephants have evolved specific biological receivers to detect these waves. They have specialized nerve endings in the foot pads and toes called Pacinian corpuscles. When an elephant miles away emits an infrasonic rumble, the seismic wave travels through the earth, hits the foot pad of the receiving elephant, travels up the dense bones of the leg, and resonates in the inner ear.
So an elephant standing silently on the savannah, seemingly doing nothing, is actually tapped into a vast, long-distance, subterranean communication network. They are listening to conversations happening 10 miles away through the earth beneath their feet, a reality we are completely deaf to.
This is the crux of overcoming anthropocentrism. True respect for animals requires us to hold two seemingly contradictory thoughts in our minds simultaneously. First, we must acknowledge our profound evolutionary similarities. The shared neurological capacity for physical pain, deep joy, debilitating grief, and complex social connection. We are all built from the same biological blueprint.
But simultaneously, we must deeply respect their absolute, unbridgeable otherness.
Exactly. They are not humans in furry suits. They are entirely distinct beings with their own unique forms of intelligence, their own evolutionary imperatives, and their own profound ways of experiencing the physics of reality.
If we truly internalize that concept, if we accept that animals are conscious individuals, experiencing their own rich realities, striving for their own specific forms of flourishing, it fundamentally shatters the Cartesian worldview. It alters everything about our moral obligations to them. Which brings us to our final exploration, implications for our shared world. What do we actually do with this knowledge?
It leads us to a crucial ethical stance outlined in the sources called moral individualism. This is the principle that how we treat a being should be based on that specific individual's capacities and characteristics, not simply their species membership. A pig, a dog, and a chimpanzee all possess a highly developed nervous system. They all have an individual welfare that matters deeply to them. They experience suffering, they desire companionship, and they seek out pleasure. The fact that humans categorize one as food, one as pet, and one as wildlife does not change the biological reality of their internal experience.
And this philosophical shift changes everything about how we view animals in captivity. For decades, the standard in a zoo or an agricultural setting was basic biological maintenance. Keep the animal fed, keep it hydrated, and keep it physically safe from predators. If you do those three things, you are supposedly fulfilling your ethical duty.
But the capabilities approach proves that is completely inadequate. A captive animal doesn't just need calories, it needs agency. Agency is the ability to actively engage with the environment, to make meaningful choices, to solve problems, to explore, and to expand competencies. When you lock a highly intelligent, emotional creature in an environment devoid of agency and treat them as interchangeable objects, the psychological results are catastrophic.
The sources highlight a devastating example of this from the Denver Zoo, involving their elephant population. It perfectly illustrates the tragedy of treating who's like its.
The zoo administration made a logistical decision to shuffle their elephant population. They had an elephant named Jolly, who is deeply bonded with two other elephants, Mimi and Candy. They had formed a tight, stable family unit over many years. The zoo decided to transfer Dolly to another facility and replace her with a new, unrelated elephant named Hope. They treated these massive, highly emotional, deeply bonded individuals like pieces of furniture that could just be moved around to balance a spreadsheet.
They completely ignored the complex social map inside the elephants' heads, and the fallout from breaking those bonds was horrific.
The disruption to the social order caused immense, immediate psychological stress. Mimi, who had lost her close companion Dolly, became highly agitated and aggressive. In her distress, she actually pushed over Candy, the older, weaker elephant. Candy was unable to get back up, and the injuries were so severe she ultimately had to be euthanized.
And the tragedy compounded.
2 days later, the newly introduced elephant, Hope, who was thrust into this traumatized, unstable social dynamic, suffered a complete psychological break. She went on a violent rampage, breaking out of her enclosure, escaping her keepers, and tearing through the zoo grounds. The lesson is undeniable. You cannot play musical chairs with highly emotional, deeply bonded individuals and expect them not to suffer catastrophic psychological breakdowns. When you deny their agency and their social needs, you destroy their minds.
We see this exact same dynamic playing out on a macro scale with the ivory crisis in Africa. Traditionally, wildlife conservation frames poaching as a numbers game. We read a headline that says, 10,000 elephants lost. It's framed as a loss of biological units, a depletion of biota.
But when you actually understand the mechanics of elephant society, when you understand that survival relies on the distributed backup server of matriarchal memory, you realize the true ecological horror of poaching.
Because the poachers don't just shoot at random, they target the largest tusks. And the largest tusks belong to the oldest females, the matriarchs.
When a poacher's bullet kills a matriarch, you aren't just killing a single biological organism. You are literally bringing down the ecological and cultural library of the entire herd. You are wiping out the stored, lived memory of where to find hidden water during a drought, how to safely navigate past human settlements, and how to maintain discipline within the family.
The researchers in the field document the aftermath of this, and they describe the surviving younger elephants as suffering from troubled minds. The social structure completely collapses. You have herds of traumatized orphans who have witnessed the brutal murder of their mothers. The young males grow up without the guidance or discipline normally enforced by the elder bulls and matriarchs. They become hyper-aggressive. The trauma echoes through the generations. It is not just a population decline, it is the total collapse of a complex civilization. It totally shifts your perspective on the entire natural world. It's the difference between looking at a massive ancient forest and just seeing a mathematical calculation of lumber board feet versus looking at that exact same forest and seeing a complex, thriving, interdependent civilization of trees and fungi and wildlife. Once you learn to see the individuals, the distinct personalities, the intricate relationships, the shared neurochemistry, you can never unsee it.
That is the ultimate, profound takeaway from the mountain of scientific research we've discussed today. The paradigm has irreversibly shifted. We have journeyed from the Cartesian arrogance of assuming human uniqueness to the awe-inspiring biological reality of a planet densely populated by incredibly diverse, feeling, thinking selves. We share this Earth with billions of conscious minds.
And that is something you can carry with you into your everyday life. The next time you interact with your pet, or you see a crow investigating a puzzle on the sidewalk or a squirrel navigating the trees in the park, remember that you aren't just looking at a biological machine operating on blind instinct. You are interacting with a creature that has specific preferences, vivid memories, deep-seated fears, and an inner life entirely its own. They are experiencing the exact same Tuesday afternoon that you are. They are just experiencing it through a completely different, profoundly complex sensory lens.
There is a remarkably provocative thought from the nature writer Henry Beston that perfectly encapsulates the tragedy and the wonder of this realization. He noted that humanity spends billions of dollars building massive technological monuments, sending powerful telescopes into the cold void of space, desperately searching the stars for any signal of alien consciousness. We are terrified of being alone in the universe, yet we are completely blind to the fact that we are already surrounded by alien nations right here on Earth. We are surrounded by minds that are vast, ancient, and highly intelligent, caught with us in the intricate net of life and time.
How much of their communication, their ecological wisdom, and their complex reality have we simply been too arrogant to hear? We've spent centuries looking at them as objects, waiting for them to speak our language. But when you look into those eyes, you aren't looking at a it, you are looking at a who. And science is finally catching up to what common sense always knew. There is absolutely someone home.